Hello, I'm Michael Thompson, the Director of the Broader Impacts in Research organization, if you are just now joining us for the fourth video. And it is good to have you back if you have already watched the first, the second, and the third video and have come back to watch the final video of this four-part series. In this video, we will begin by talking about contextualizing what you are going to do for your NSF BI, and then move into a discussion about developing and knowing how your BI and BIAs fit into your proposal. We will then talk about implementing, writing, developing, and choosing your BIAs and the 9 practical ways for doing it. And lastly, we will conclude with a discussion on writing the BI narrative and BI summary. So with that said, welcome to the new faculty NSF BI workshop seminar series overview, Part 4 on the practical applications for developing, choosing, implementing, and writing your NSF broader impacts. Now, if we go back to that definition, a process with stakeholders or people for achieving a specified goal that is society beneficial in a finite time that's measured, there's several different aspects of society to consider, because this becomes to be a question. Well, if I'm going to have to deal with NSF broader impacts, what would be acceptable, what would not be acceptable, what can I do that would be a natural extension or something that's coming naturally from my research? And so any aspect of society, whether it's in the university community, the local community, the state community, the regional community, the national community, that when we begin to think about global or international, because it's a National Science Foundation, we have to take that into consideration because it is the National Science Foundation. But how can we look at all those or pick one of those types of communities or individuals in that community or groups within those different communities to help achieve one of the NSF BI areas? And those NSF BI areas, there's 9. It could be full participation of women or people with disabilities. It could be improved well-being of individuals in society, etc. And so there's really 9. And those 9 that we can break those down in 4 different areas. We talk about broadening participation. So if that's something that's within something that you're very interested in, that may be something that you might want to focus on. There is, within the goal, the education and infrastructure. So we have improved STEM education developer at any level, increased public scientific literacy, and public engagement with science and technology, and enhanced infrastructure for research and education. We have the green, which is industry and competitiveness. And just in case you can't figure out something to fit in, we have everything else, which is improved well-being of individuals in society. But if you're thinking in a conceptual framework, well, that makes sense because broader impacts can happen in a lot of different areas. So it makes sense for them to have that in there. So we want to know where your broader impacts and broader impacts activities fit into the proposal. So we're going to begin to talk a little bit about that. Because once we begin to understand a little basics of broader impacts, we then need to figure out how we're going to fit those within the context of NSF. Now keep in mind, in the next workshop series, we're going to begin to break that down, and even then in the workshop series after that, as far as the writing, we're going to break that down even further and show you exactly how to write those. But we're trying to cover a lot of things, right? Give you a wealth of information, allow you to kind of begin to look at this information, kind of think about it, and then be able to move on it as we continue through this workshop. There are some things that we should consider when we're thinking about NSF proposals. Now, the first thing that you need to keep in mind is that broader impacts within the context of NSF proposals should be demonstrated almost everywhere. It's not good enough for you to have that in your 1-page summary. It's not good enough for you to have that in your 15-page narrative, right? You need to have that as well in your supplemental documents. So there's several different places when we begin to think about showing broader impacts and where we should begin to think about how we could demonstrate that we're going to have a broader impact, or that we're having some broader impact activities that we need to be making sure that we show them in specific areas. So when we look at this, and you have this also in your folder, it compares the intellectual merit to the broader impacts. And intellectual merit encompasses the potential to advance knowledge, and I think For the most part, most researchers are very familiar with the intellectual merit, especially as it answers those questions on the left that's underneath the criterion defined. And we went over there. To what extent do the proposed activities suggest and explore creative, originally, or potentially transformative concepts, and so forth. So for the intellectual merit, it's been relatively easy for faculty to go through and say, okay, well, I know I have to have this here, I know I have to have this here. But when we look at broader impacts, we need to begin to really think about, is my broader impacts creative? Is it original? Is it potentially transformative? There's always this idea about being able to specifically talk about, to make sure that it's well organized, well structured, based on sound rationale. That doesn't necessarily mean that faculty have been thinking about that for their broader impacts. Within the context of broader impacts, we need to be thinking about how specifically, or what we're going to specifically do, or who we're specifically going to be working with. And what activities are we specifically going to do to help us to accomplish our broader impacts if it's an extension of the research. Because if you remember, broader impacts could be within the research itself, it could be through the research, or it could be as an extension or with the research. So there's three different ways, because broader impacts is everywhere, and broader impacts can happen through almost anything. When we begin to ask about how qualified is an individual, team, or organization, in the intellectual merit, most of us think about, okay, well, we know we need to have our bio sketch, we need to talk about our research expertise, we need to talk about our facilities, equipment, and other resources. But when it comes to broader impacts, we're not necessarily thinking about that. So you might have, for example, your facilities, equipment, and other resources, your FEOR, and you may talk about, well, this is my lab. I have this for my lab. Maybe there's the microscopy lab over here. Maybe there's this physics lab over here. Maybe we have this or this, but you're not talking about, for example, well, there might be the broader impacts of research organization. There might be the Center for Research Program Development and Enrichment. There might be the Office of Undergraduate Research. There might be other different organizations that are around that would need to fit into your facilities, equipment, and other resources, because those are things that are also showing that you are serious about accomplishing your broader impacts. This also goes with talking about the adequate resources. So in your intellectual merit, you will be able to describe what is available to perform the research. You'll talk about other collaborators. But within your broader impacts, you may not specifically want to talk about that. And you have to, and you need to. And so thinking about that in your project summary, your project description, your bio sketch, your FEOR, your data management plan, your letters of commitment, almost anywhere that you are going to have your supplemental documents, or you're going to be talking about broader impacts, it needs to be throughout the document to show that you're actually saying what you're going to do, right? And to prove that you're actually doing this. We've already said basically that broader impacts is everywhere. So when we begin to think about broader impacts, we need to think about it in your project summary. We need to think about it in your project narrative. So for your broader impacts, you typically have between 1 to 2 pages. When you're a PI or you're working with a co-PI, you need to think about your synergistic activities, your collaborators, your students, your publications. Even if you've had past funding. So not only is NSF talking about broader impacts that, oh, well, what are you going to do? Well, if you've had past funding, you need to begin to talk about your broader impacts and the data that you've gotten from your broader impacts and how beneficial that has been in the past. So just like you have to talk about your current and pending research, you have to talk about your current and pending broader impacts or your broader impact activities or whatever you're planning on doing that's going to show that you're having a broader impact of your proposed activities. That could include letters of commitment. That may be your data management plan. That could be dealing with a postdoc mentoring plan, because that could be included as broader impacts. Now, postdoc mentoring plans, you don't necessarily need them if you're not having postdocs, but if you plan on having postdocs, that's a great broader impact. Right down to the suggested reviewers, and then there's a type of language that's associated with that. And one of the things that we could help you do is to figure out what kind of language to talk about societal benefits of the proposed project, to use certain terminology within the context of how the 1 through 9 outcomes that NSF has. And so all of that, you have to make sure that you have that being represented throughout all of the areas in your NSF proposal. And we always like to say the earlier that you ask, the better. Now that we've kind of told you a little bit about what broader impacts is, how you should be thinking about how it should go into your NSF proposal, different places, we're going to begin to get a little bit more specific about implementing, writing your broader impacts activities. And this is assuming that you already know what your outcomes are. So the first question that you need to begin to ask when we're thinking about this, before we're getting even to your broader impact activities, is what kind of benefits do I want to achieve? Because just like anything else, if you're just randomly doing something without a conceptual and theoretical framework, then you're just randomly doing something. And so this conceptual theoretical framework for broader impacts is our broader impacts identity, our outcomes, our outputs, our activities, and our inputs. And so even if you don't like to think about broader impact activity, at least you have to think about what outcomes. If you're not doing that, then you don't have broader impacts, you just have random activities. So thinking about that becomes important. And those activities are there to help you to accomplish that outcome or to that benefit. And that's why you also probably need to evaluate them. Now, there's 9 practical applications for developing, choosing, or implementing and writing your broader impact activities. And remember, this is a lot of information, and we're really going to unpack this throughout the next set of workshops. Okay, but we're just giving you kind of a dump. That way you can really begin to go, okay, well, I didn't think about this, or I thought about this, or what is this, right? Right? One of the things that, especially as new faculty coming in, that is really important is to begin to get a sense of your director or your program. So talk to your program officer and get a better idea, because with each individual different directorate, you might have a specific interest in different things, or they might be able to give you certain suggestions. Each specific directorate, whether you're going in engineering or whether you're in physics or whether you're in biology, there's probably certain types of activities that sometimes they like to see, or things that they might like to see go on that they may like to call broader impacts. So just like you would go and probably talk to your program officer to find out if the research it's a decent idea. They may not give you all of every single and say, yes, this is a great idea, but if you talk to program officers, you may be able to say, okay, well, this might fit within this specific area. You can begin to try to get an idea of how your broader impacts are fitting in those specific areas. Now, as we've said before, right, all reviewers and all directorates are different. But what we're trying to do, especially with the National Alliance for Broader Impacts, we're trying to standardize that across the board. But in order to make sure that you're kind of hitting all the areas, you want to kind of try to stick with the middle ground, especially for your general proposals. So that's a mixture of very traditional broader impact activities and innovative broader impact activities. Assuming that you already know what you want your outcomes to be. Now, I'm going to say that your outcomes, you should probably only have basically 1 to 3 outcomes that you're wanting to achieve. And then under that, you may have 1 to 3 activities that you're going to do. Okay. So it's important to make sure that you're not doing so many activities that they know that you're never going to get any of it done, because your activities should support your outcomes. So you could have 1 or 2 outcomes and then have 3 activities that are going to support you reaching your outcomes or supporting to those benefits. So it's important to cover a middle ground when you're not sure. So if you haven't talked to the program officer and you don't kind of know, you begin to put in with innovative and some traditional. Now, there is some leeway sometimes when it comes to new faculty if they know you're new faculty. So keep that in mind, but you're trying to build this over time. For your BI statement, and we talk about this BI statement, which is especially important for your narrative, an overarching statement that helps you to contextualize. It shouldn't have complicated language, and it should be very easy to find, so it's at the very beginning. And I'll give you an example for if I'm talking about research. So if I begin to talk to you about the characterization of the SNG1-6 deletion mutant reveals trisulfolated and disulfolated compounds for something of substrate specificity, I've probably lost you. If I say that there is a couple of pathways that are important for the paper and pulp industry, and we're going to better understand this research, and it's going to improve X, Y, and Z, you probably are going to more likely listen to what I'm saying. A little bit less complicated language. This is the same principle that you have when you're talking about broader impacts. So if you've gotten so far into the weeds and you haven't been able to contextualize what this really is talking about to the audience, you're already going to lose those. Lose the reviewers, you're going to lose people. And once you've got them lost, you're looking at maybe 15 minutes for a whole proposal, then it's over. Now, when writing and thinking, and we've covered this a little bit about choosing your broader impact activities, you need to think about at what level. So we talked about, are you talking at the local level? You're talking about the university level? You're talking about at the national level? Which level are you talking about? Which are your particular populations when you're thinking about this? So you've thought about your outcomes. So I want to increase, or I want to help broaden the participation of women through this particular program doing X, Y, and Z. In that case, at what level do you want to do it? Obviously, I better talk about my particular population, and then you need to think about, well, how is this tied with your assessment and evaluation? And we're going to get into evaluating and assessing about broader impacts, because that's important. How do you know that you've achieved the benefit or your outcome? How do you know that it's actually been done if you don't assess it or evaluate it? Now, here's another thing. How reasonable will it be to accomplish? So when we begin to think about quality over quantity, that's why we're saying you only need a couple of activities. You have some general outcomes, and you only have maybe 1 to 3 activities that you want to do. And these are for, individual proposals, maybe with a co-PI. So if you're aiming to do like 6 different activities or have 6 different things, more than likely you're not going to accomplish it. It's probably unreasonable. So remember, quality over quantity. You need to talk about your partnerships. So if I'm going to talk to you and say, hey, I want to help broaden the participation of women by doing X, Y, and Z program, and I don't have any partnerships with any women, there's a problem. If I haven't talked about that in my proposal, well, ding, 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 I know that you're probably not really meaning what you're saying, because you haven't even taken the time to organize your thought and tell us the different pieces of this. Will there be tiered impacts based off of your activities? So you could have, so there may be learning that may involve, but maybe there's another piece where they get excited about a STEM field. Maybe there's another piece where they learn something, because you could have multiple impacts, or multiple, actually, we'll say broader impacts off of series of activities. But typically, and I'll just say this as a general rule of thumb, if you're talking about broader impacts, you have your outcomes, your outputs are your numbers, and we'll get into that later. You have your activities. Your activities should support your outcomes. So you don't want to say your activities are accomplishing all of these different things. You want to be more specific and strategic on which activities you're doing to help support your outcomes, to help you achieve the benefit. The other thing that we have to say is be specific in your writing. Just like in your research, when you're talking about your intellectual merit, when you're going through, you're probably going to say what you're working with, how you plan on doing it, the techniques that you're going to use. You're probably going to have your research question. You're going to have what you're desiring on doing. You have very specifics, right down to the amount of chemical if you're using agar. We'll just say agar, right down to the amount of chemical in your agar. You've gotten very detailed. If you can't do that in your writing of your broader impacts, they know that you're not very serious about your broader impacts. All of these things are very, very important. Now, here's something that most people don't think about, and this is a relatively big mistake. Just like in your research, you probably have documentation somewhere of your research. You got papers, you might have a website, you probably have collaborators, you probably have presentations that you've done your research on. You've got a lot of places where you can say, this is the actual research that I'm doing, and what I say I'm doing, I'm actually doing. You need to have that with what I would say your broader impacts identity, because your broader impacts identity is what's guiding your outcomes, your outputs, your activities, your inputs. So you need to have documented evidence of your outcomes. You need to have documented evidence of your activities, documented evidence of your outputs. And then for NSS, especially if you've already got awarded before, you definitely need to have of your inputs. All of those different things, you need to have document evidence. So that could be posters, that could be Twitter, that could be Facebook, that could be your website. That could be the broader impacts guy, that posting things about the things that you're doing for your broader impacts. All of these different types of things that you could put in the FEOR, you could begin to talk about. You know, people, if they're actually looking at your proposal or if they're thinking about you, even though they don't have to, they could go to those things and take a look. It becomes very important. Now, this piece, generate a timeline for your research and your BI, that is overall just a good idea. I'm going to tell you that first. That's overall just a good idea. But this is also very important when you're talking about developing your broader impacts, your broader impact activities, or your broader impact program or portfolio. It's also very important when you're thinking, if any of you are thinking about writing for the NSF career, this becomes super important. Having a timeline for your research and your BI, especially if you're right, especially to put it even in your proposal. Because just like your research doesn't happen overnight, broader impacts is not going to happen overnight. It takes time. Now, when we're talking about outcomes, it's important that we begin to think about whether they're short-term, they're mid-term, they're long-term outcomes, right? And what are those broader impact activities that will help you guarantee success, right? And we've kind of pushed that, but that becomes very important. Right? And you're always make sure that you accomplish what you say you will do. Because if you ever plan on applying to NSF again at some point in time, and especially if you got awarded, you have to talk about your broader impacts that you already accomplished in the past. So it's important that whatever you're saying, you got to make sure that you can accomplish it. So what we want to do is get you to start doing that before you even start. And that's something that we're going to help you do with the FISAP and the basically five-part development plan. And we're going to get you to figure out what is your broader impacts professional identity. And then we're going to begin to get you to think about, okay, well, if I like to do this and my work is going here, then these are probably some of the outcomes that I would like to do. So how can we achieve that? And then what groups may I like to work with? And we're going to help you go through that. And then after that, then how do I write that based off of using outcomes, outputs, activities, and inputs? Because there's a specific way that you can use that and put that within the context of your writing that makes everything very clear. You need to also be able to talk, just like we're talking about what are your outcomes. Well, your outcomes should fit into those 1 through 9. You should be able to contextualize those. That becomes very important. So you should know how your broader impacts activities fit into your outcomes, but how they also fit through those 1 through 9 NSF big overarching goals. Now, the last thing of the 9 is that you need to have BI pilot data like you need to have research pilot data. And people don't necessarily talk about this as often. 2 years ago, 3 years, 4 years ago, maybe that wasn't the case. But you have to remember that this is evolving. Broader impacts is evolving. And as you can see where you're even looking at the National Science or National Alliance for Broader Impacts Guiding Principles document, you can begin to look at that and you can see how those are changing over time and how NSF is moving. But now, just like you have your research data, you probably need to have some pilot data to say that you're actually doing what you say you've been doing. Which means starting earlier, or starting as early as possible to begin to get that developed. A lot of faculty, what they will do is they will wait basically a week before the proposal is due, and then say, I got to figure out what my broader impacts are, and then try to write a series of activities, and then ask for help. It used to be maybe you could get away with that, but in increasing more and more across NSF, that is not going to work. So it's important to begin to think about all of these things now, and we can help you do that. The last thing that we want to talk about is we're going to talk just a little bit about project summary. And this is what I'm going to suggest to you about project summary. So there's 2 parts. We have the 1-page overview, so where we have the summary, you have to have an intellectual merit section that describes your intellectual merit in that 1 page. You have to have a entitled Broader Impacts, and it has to have a summary. And then in your 15-page, you probably need to have at least 1 to 2 pages if you're having basically a basic research proposal. And you're an individual PI or you have a co-PI. Once you get over $1 million, then we begin to change how broader impacts should be all put together. But for the most part, when you're first starting out, this is the kind of a frame. I suggest that you write your narrative first before you do your summary, because your summary should reflect what your narrative is. So if you can't write a good narrative, then you won't write a good summary. And a good summary should talk about who will benefit in your community. It should probably talk a little bit about the audience, why they will benefit, how they will benefit, and what you plan to do. Because in that area, that begins to talk a little bit about the outcomes, it begins to talk about the community, it begins to talk a little bit about the activities, and it begins to give an idea of that you're probably going to assess what you're doing. And so if you say, okay, well, was this project summary, was it from an awarded proposal? The answer is yes. What we don't want you to get hooked on is always looking at awarded proposals. And the reason is this: what happened 2 years ago may not be the same thing as what happens now. You know, there's been several occasions that I've looked at someone's broader impacts and they've written this proposal for a consecutive of over 3 years. The first one started, no comment, broader impacts is great. They didn't talk about evaluation, they weren't very specific, they just put down some random activities, it wasn't situated within the context of outcomes, and they were all very, very happy. The second time that they did it, there was more questions about, well, where is your evaluation a little bit? And we're not really sure how you're really going to accomplish that just a little bit. Their third time was, you have no evaluation, it's not very well planned, it's not very specific, we don't believe that you can do this. The same exact thing. So it's changing over time. So a lot of times what happens with faculty, especially when they're looking at broader impacts, they will go, show us a awarded proposal. Awarded proposals are great to give you some ideas, but what happened 2 years ago may not be able to happen now. So what you should be doing is striving for the excellence for what you're doing and what under the current strategies and guidelines now, versus trying to mimic what an awarded proposal happened 3 years ago. Just keep that in mind. But if you were to look and say, what are the different pieces for a good project summary, these be the good pieces. And you have this in your PowerPoint. Now, if you're thinking about BI and narratives, there's some hints about how to put different things in your broader impacts narrative. What we're going to do at a specific time, after we've helped you develop and think what you're going to do and get you to begin to do it, when we have you write it, there's a way that we're going to specifically have you then organize it where it becomes very clear based off of outcomes, outputs, activities, and then inputs in different areas.